Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this public meeting. As has been said before, we're the only party prepared to put ourselves in front of the public. And I must say, the audiences are getting bigger, the questions, in many cases, are getting more complicated and harder, but we'll do our best to answer them. You know, the one thing that I'm hearing from people is that they actually genuinely want change. Because they're actually rather tired of a set of politicians from, well, it was three parties at the last election. I'm not sure after this election that the Lib Dems will qualify as a major party. But whether you look at the front bench of the Conservative Party or the Labour Party or the Liberal Democrats, what you see is basically the same kind of people. People that go to the same handful of schools, that nearly all go to the same university, that all do the same degree, and then, what do? They become researchers. In MPs' offices, they become members of Parliament aged 27 or 28, cabinet ministers in their early 40s, and I put it to you that this country is now badly run by a bunch of college kids who've got no connection with real people or ordinary life in any way whatsoever. And we're a party made up of ordinary people from a wide range of backgrounds. You've heard from David. I myself left school at 18 and went straight to work in London in the metal trading industry. I spent 20 years doing that, and the last 9 years of it as my own boss, running my own company. So I know what it's like, you know, to deal with the commercial banks, to employ people, to deal with rules and regulations. You know, I understand what it's like in the real world. I've actually had a proper job. How about that? I mean, it really is something, isn't it? But I often say that I can proudly claim, hand on heart, that I worked in the private sector, and I worked damned hard for 20 years, up until lunchtime, every single day. And then we stopped for a pint, you know. Although not this January, which I got through without having one. No, my motivation for getting into politics happened a long time ago, back in 1990, when the Conservative government of the day signed us up to something called the exchange rate mechanism. It was the precursor to Britain joining what has now become the euro. And I thought this was absolutely crazy. And yes, I shouted at the television very loudly. And I saw a Conservative Party, supported by the Lib Dems and Labour, preparing Britain to become part of the euro. And then I saw a treaty 20 years ago that took place in somewhere called Maastricht in the Netherlands. And the idea of this treaty is that what my mum and dad had voted for in 1975, and by the way, to have voted in that referendum on the EEC, or what was known then as the, remember, common market, you know, you now have to be 57 years old. So anybody under 57 has never even had the chance to vote on this. But what my mum and dad had voted on was for us to have trading links with Europe and to have friendly relations with our next door neighbours. I dare say I'd have voted for it had I been old enough in 1975. But what became clear to me in the early 1990s was that actually that had been a terrific con job. And what had been sold as being very innocuous was actually designed to be a political superstate with its own flag, which of course it's now got, its own anthem, which I refuse to stand up for when they play it in the European Parliament, and indeed its own president, without whom he wouldn't have been as well known as he was across the rest of Europe. So I realised 20 years ago we were headed in this direction, and I took this view, ladies and gentlemen. The view that I took was this, that we as a country are an absolutely unique place. We have, since Magna Carta, actually had one of the best forms of protection between the individual and the state that has ever existed anywhere in the world. We are the country that picked up the concept of democracy and turned it into parliamentary democracy. Yes, I know that the Isle of Man and Iceland will say they've been at it for longer, but we're the first big country that really did this. But I also took the view that we were the country who actually had stood up, certainly in the 20th century, and at massive sacrifice from men and women that came from villages like this, at massive sacrifice, defeated evil and won a battle for freedom and liberty. And if that freedom and liberty did not mean that we were not to be able to call ourselves an independent country and to govern ourselves through the ballot box, then something had been given away that was actually far more important than just talking about money. I took the view 20 years ago that our political class had given away our country, and I resolved then, I want my country back. That's why I started this political journey, and that's why I stand here today before you as the parliamentary candidate for South Thanet. None of the rest will talk about it. But 75% of our laws are made somewhere else. We pay a membership fee of £55 million a day. Every single one of our 4.9 million men and women that run small businesses or act as sole traders, and I bet there are some in the room today, are up to here with excessive rules and regulations, stifling enterprise and stifling business. To add to that, we've been forced, as a result of being a member of this club, to turn our backs on an organisation that has within it 2.2 billion people, where they speak English, where they have common law, where they like us, and where they come and stand by our side when times are tough. And it is complete madness for this country to believe that its future is purely one of Europe. I want us to be friendly with our European neighbours. I want us to trade with our European neighbours, but I want us also to re-embrace our relationship with the Commonwealth and the rest of the world. Let's have a global future for Britain and not just a little European backyard. I fought hard for these things for 20 years, and during the 1990s I stood in election after election. In fact, I was UKIP's first ever election candidate, and I stood for the party in the Eastleigh by-election back in 1994, and I managed by a clear whopping margin of 162 votes to beat the late screaming Lord Such into last place. And I kept on standing all through the 1990s in parliamentary elections and by-elections and European elections, and I began to wonder whether perhaps I was to become the patron saint of lost causes. But I kept on going. But I think there's been a growing awareness, certainly over the last 5 or 6 years, that actually the things that I was saying were right. That actually we had given away the ability to govern ourselves. Certainly the fishermen in the Kent beaches and harbours felt it some time ago, and our businessmen and women have felt it. But I think the one issue that has really woken up the great British public to what membership of this European club means is the question of immigration. It is the question of immigration, and I want to make this point absolutely clear, please, to all of you. There is a very concerted and deliberate media attempt taking place through television companies, in particular one that we're forced to pay a licence fee for every year, which I think should be cut quite radically. Maybe we'll get a question about that later. But whether it's through the BBC or Channel 4, or whether it's through our national newspapers, understand this. We as UKIP are now posing the biggest threat to the establishment that has been seen in modern Britain. And they are fighting back and fighting as dirty as they possibly can. All they need to do is to find one person to make some horrible comment to attempt to portray UKIP as being against all foreign people and being against the world. Folks, if you've come along to hear that, you've come to the wrong place. It simply isn't true. But we do believe that it is wholly irresponsible to carry on with an immigration policy that net is bringing us an extra 250,000 people a year. And the point is, and David Cameron can tell you he'll reduce it to tens of thousands and fail. Ed Miliband and Nick Clegg try and bury their heads in the sand whenever the question is raised. The point is this, folks, it doesn't matter, given the status quo, who the next government is. There is nothing they can do to control immigration. They are impotent on this issue because we now have an open door to nearly 500 million people from southern and eastern Europe, any of which can come into this country. We've had a net increase of our population through immigration of over 4 million people in the course of the last 15 years. It is something that is wholly unprecedented in the history of this country. And who can doubt that the reason we have this massive pressure this winter on the National Health Service, it's actually quite simple, folks, isn't it? There are more people in the country using the National Health Service. It's the same reason we have pressure on our primary school places, where we need to find a further 250,000 places in the next 5 years. And there are many other knock-on effects. Now, I want to say this to you. We are not against immigration. We believe in controlling immigration, and only by divorcing ourselves from the European Union can we bring back border controls, and what UKIP would do is to put in place an Australian-style point system. When you think about it, that wasn't very radical, was it? It's just a bit of plain common sense. It's actually what over 200 countries in the world do. They choose who can come. They say we want people with trades and skills, but we don't want people with criminal records. We don't want people with life-threatening diseases. And it's messages like this that I think are bringing people on side with UKIP. We will fight this general election in a different way to all of the others. You know, it's the first ever fixed-term Parliament this country's ever seen. And as a result of knowing the date, as soon as January the 2nd came along, the first working day of the year, the two big parties began their campaigns, firing artillery shells against each other. I don't know about you, but even though I'm engaged in politics, I have already found what they have to say incredibly boring. Every single morning there's a pledge about more money. Goodness only knows where it's going to come from, given the deficit we're running. And I think with most of the public, this stuff is actually going in one ear and out of the other ear. But what I've also noticed is this. The Labour Party have sought help. Well, I suppose they probably does need a bit of help in many ways. But the Labour Party have sought help from a guy called David Axelrod, a big American spin doctor. David Cameron has sought help from Jim Messina, another Washington-based big American spin doctor. Any of you that have ever been to America or seen American elections will know that it is now entirely negative campaigning. It is telling the public how awful the other bloke is. And that's what our politics has sunk to. This campaign is all about negativity. This campaign is all about ad hominem attacks on the other person. And of course, plenty of those directed at me as well. And what I'm going to say to you is this, that we are not going to stoop or sink to their level. I was told years ago of a wonderful phrase that was given by the late Lord Admiral Jackie Fisher, one of the greatest men that ever lived, and had a sea area named after him. And Fisher had a saying, and it was this: if you pick a fight with a chimney sweep, you get covered in soot. And that is what I'm going to apply. They can be as damn rude about me and what we stand for as they want. We are going to ignore it, and we are going to fight both on Dover District and Thanet District, and in Dover and Deal Parliamentary Constituency, and in South Thanet Parliamentary Constituency. We're going to stand here and tell you what we are for. We're going to fight a positive campaign, and I hope and believe in doing that we'll bring some hope and some inspiration to people. We will bring to us people who previously have voted Conservative, who have previously voted Labour, who have previously voted Liberal Democrat, and perhaps even more crucially, and David touched on this, we will bring back into politics people who haven't voted for anybody for the last 20 years, because we're giving them something to believe in. We are an unashamedly patriotic political party. But being patriotic doesn't mean you hate anybody else. It means you've decided it's time to put Britain and the interests of the British people first. And that will be the basis of our campaign, and it's on that I would ask you to vote for us on May the 7th. And of course the campaign, apart from the themes I've touched on, will be dominated by the National Health Service and dominated by the state of the economy. And yes, we will have things that are different to say on that. Everybody seems to think that by just promising more money for the National Health Service, you will solve all of its problems. Well, let's be frank, we are going to need more money for the National Health Service because, as I've said already, the population is going up, but also significantly, the population is now ageing at a rate that nobody could ever have foreseen. But just throwing money at a problem, just allowing politicians to spend tens of billions, doesn't necessarily solve anything. And I was looking at a figure, a letter I got from a South London GP the other day, and he pointed out to me that between 2002 and 2012, net spending on the National Health Service increased by 84%. But the number of beds available in National Health hospitals fell by 26% in the same corresponding period. So what we've actually got is the National Health Service as an example of public services into which we pour vast sums of money but don't get the right delivery. And the UKIP approach to that will very simply be, that it's unacceptable that there's been a 48% increase in middle management of the NHS since 1997. We will campaign and fight for a streamlined NHS in terms of its management structures. We will campaign and fight for an NHS in which you, the public, are able to vote for the directors on the boards of the hospitals. I believe by getting direct accountability into this, we'll actually be able to get rid of people that aren't very good. Oh, and while we're at it, one thing that we can do that won't cost a lot of money, but I think be universally popular, is we will abolish car parking charges for people visiting hospitals. We will campaign in this general election for a complete rethink on the foreign aid budget. Mr. Cameron tells us that it's his proudest achievement in government that the United Kingdom now spends more on foreign aid than any other Western country. But if you boil it down, folks, we're now spending nearly £1 billion a month on our foreign aid budget, 12 billion a year, due to go up to 13 billion a year within the next 2. Of that, just over 2 billion is spent on providing vaccinations for polio, is spent on providing clean drinking water, is spent on things that we would all think to be good, Christian, decent things for us to do. But the other 9 or 10 billion is spent as an extension of foreign aid, propping up questionable regimes all over the world, and we will end that expenditure and be better off as a result of it. And we will campaign for an honest debate about the state of the British economy. Yes, we have growth back in the British economy, that is good, although unsurprising after a few years of decline. I mean, this is the natural way that markets work. This coalition government was elected, if you remember, and then Cameron got together with Nick Clegg in that really enchanting ceremony in the garden of number 10 Downing Street. And the reason the government got together, do you remember there was one reason they got together? They were going to eradicate the annual deficit. That is why they got together. That deficit, ladies and gentlemen, is currently running at £90 billion a year. We are adding to our national debt to the tune of £90 billion a year. And I heard George Osborne yesterday saying we should vote for him on the grounds of economic competence because of the work they've done to reduce the deficit. Well, let me give you the bare figures, because it isn't very pretty, but it's the truth. When George Osborne became Chancellor, our national debt was £850 billion. That's 5 years ago. It is now £1.5 trillion. This government has doubled the national debt. This government has increased the national debt by more than Labour managed to in the 13 years that they were in power. Now, I'm not saying there are easy answers to this. There aren't. But I've given you some ideas. £10 billion a year we can save from the foreign aid budget. And yes, I'm going to come back to the great European question that nobody else wants to talk about. We pay a gross membership fee to the EU of £55 million a day. A net membership fee of over £10 billion a year. So we pay £10 billion a year net to Brussels for them to regulate our businesses and industries, to take away our rights to fish in the English Channel, and for all of it, they sell us far more motor cars made in Germany than we sell them cars made in Sunderland or Swindon or elsewhere. And do you know what we would do? We would just buy and sell goods from each other. We would let customers make choices, and we would not pay a penny piece into the EU budget after we get the referendum, thereby saving the country another £10 billion a year. And we'll certainly scrap, if we have anything to do with it, the ludicrous 50, 60, 70, do I hear any advance on 70, maybe it's £80 billion that HS2 is going to cost just to help 6% of the travelling population. So we've got some positive ideas about what we can do. But the question, I guess, that you're all going to want to ask is it worth voting for UKIP, even if we believe in what you do? Well, let me put this to you. In 2014, not only did we win the European elections, which in itself was quite an achievement, but we saw Douglas Carswell and Mark Reckless, we saw them, I'm used to heckling, not phone calls, but anyway. We saw Carswell and Reckless not just join UKIP, but have the honour and integrity to resign their seats, saying that the constituents of Clacton and Rochester were the bosses, and to put themselves up for by-elections. And I think in doing that, what UKIP did last year was actually to bring some honesty and integrity back into British politics. And I'm delighted they both won this week. We won those two by-elections, and on the same day as Clacton, we came within a whisker of beating Labour in one of their heartlands in Rochdale in the Haywood and Middleton by-election. I said at the start of 2014, I wanted to cause an earthquake in British politics. I don't think we gave it a bad shot in 2014. The first past the post electoral system is very, very tough. And in areas where there is a massive Labour majority or a massive Conservative majority, it'll be very hard for us to break through. But there are parts of the country, and East Kent is one of them. Take Dover, take Thanet, constituencies that since 1997 have swung back and forth from Labour and Conservative. Constituencies in which there is a big vote, or there has been a big vote, for both parties. The point about UKIP is we draw our support equally from across the board. Because what we're campaigning on are not issues about left-wing politics or right-wing politics. They're issues of national importance that cross those boundaries. If you read the Daily Mail, they'll tell you that if you vote UKIP, you'll get a Labour government. In fact, David Cameron majored on this in his conference speech. He said, and it's not perhaps a particularly pleasant spectre, he said, if you go to bed with Nigel Farage, you will wake up with Ed Miliband. Now this is fairly scary stuff, isn't it? And this is what they're putting out there. And yet today, in Sandwich, knocking on a door, a young couple there, bloke said to me, well, he said, okay, I'm thinking about it. He said, but of course everyone here says that if you vote UKIP, you'll split the Labour vote and you'll let the Tories win. So these arguments are going back and forth. The truth of it, as we showed in Clacton, as we showed in Rochester and Stroud, and as we can prove in these constituencies, like South Thanet and like Dover, is in constituencies like this, if you vote UKIP, you will get UKIP. We cannot possibly expect to win the general election, but what we can expect to do is to get a good number of MPs in Parliament. It is now perfectly clear that Ed Miliband will not have an outright majority. Labour is not bouncing under his leadership at all, and in Scotland they've lost huge ground to the SNP. Similarly, Mr Cameron's Conservative vote is now back to its base. He's managed to lose 25% of voters since the last election. They're not going back to him for a variety of reasons. I think the Conservatives will be the biggest party, but they too will not have a majority. We have an opportunity, numerically, if this goes as I think it could, to find ourselves in the same position that Nick Clegg was back in 2010. I promise you that if I'm in that position, there'll be no lovely ceremonies in the Rose Garden of Downing Street. There'll be no ministerial car. What there will be is me driving a deal. And the deal is simple. I believe this country should be a self-governing democratic nation that makes its own laws and control its own borders. And the only way we can get that is to have a full, free and fair referendum. And when I say fair, I mean fair, with spending limits for both sides, an ombudsman appointed to make sure that the BBC and the broadcasters you'll get your chance, the BBC and the broadcasters both give the same sides equal access. A fair referendum, one where the question asked isn't skewed and is actually neutral. And I will use that strength and power to campaign within Parliament for all the things I've said to you this afternoon. But in terms of doing a deal and propping up a Cameron government, I will use the power of UKIP's numbers to make sure this country gets that historic chance to take back our birthright and what is rightfully ours. Thank you very much.